If you're dealing with an abusive debt collector, the question will naturally arise, well, what's the best way to stop this? Some people will tell you it is to send a cease and desist letter. Some people will say, well, if you just ignore them, they will go away. Some people will say, well, if you pay it. And then some people will say, if you sue, that's the best way. So let's look at these very quickly. If we're talking about an honorable debt collector that is not harassing you, then yes, a cease and desist letter will cause that collector anyway to not call you anymore. Now, they may send it to another debt collector who will then start calling. But if we're talking about an abusive, harassing debt collector, then getting a letter that says, don't ever call me again, they'll just ignore that. If they're willing to call your neighbors, your coworkers, your family members and violate the law, they're willing to ignore a cease and desist letter. Well, what about just ignoring the debt collectors? Well, if it's an abusive debt collector, they're going to always want to ratchet up, increase the intensity of the collection activities against you. So, yeah, maybe they're calling you, and they may stop doing that, but now they're going to call your mother-in-law. Now they're going to call your neighbors, your co-workers, people at church, wherever they can find somebody. And they'll be willing to break the law if they're an abusive debt collector. Well, what about third option? So we talked about a cease communications letter, just ignoring them. What about paying them? Well, certainly if it's a debt you owe, then you want to pay that debt. Now, I will say this, if you're dealing with an abusive debt collector, it may not be such a good idea to pay that debt collector for the debt. But if you can pay the original creditor, or if there's somebody else that you can pay, sometimes a debt buyer will buy a debt, they'll give it to a debt collector to collect, but you can sometimes contact that original debt buyer and say, look, I'll pay you or I'll pay somebody else. But I'll say this, if you're dealing with an abusive debt collector and you end up paying them, then don't be surprised if they come back later collecting the same debt. Because after all, they're an abusive debt collector. This is what they do. And so this is a fairly common situation. If you're looking at paying a debt buyer, then you got to make sure that that debt buyer really owns the debt. And so that can be complicated. So in some ways it's a perfect solution. Yeah, just pay the collector and they'll stop abusing you. But sometimes that doesn't work out. And it may be a debt that you do not owe, and the debt collector is still saying, well, look, just pay me and I'll stop abusing you. Well, that's kind of extortion, isn't it, or blackmail? So that may not be the best solution. Here's what we think often, not always, but often is the best solution. If you're dealing with an abusive debt collector, sue that collector under federal law and under state law. And when you sue them, and they know that they've been caught, so they look at your lawsuit, they go, we got caught doing this. Now we got to pay our lawyer, we got to pay the consumer's lawyers, we're going to pay damages to the consumer. That tends to make them immediately shut down all collection activity against you. And so that, we have found, is the best way to do this. And if that debt collector does not own the debt, normally the original creditor or even a debt buyer will take it away from them and give it to somebody else. And then that may be an honorable debt collector that you can deal with and you can settle your debt. So I hope this has been helpful to you. If you live in Alabama and have questions about what to do if you're dealing with an abusive debt collector and whether or not you should sue an abusive debt collector, feel free to give us a call, 205-879-2447, or alabamaconsumer.com is our website, and you can contact us through there. Thank you.